In the small town of Edenwood, located in the northeast of the United States, life is peaceful and warm. This town is like a delicate picture frame, with changing seasons, tidy houses lining the streets, and harmonious relationships between neighbors. Everyone knows each other, and familiar faces can always be seen in the corner cafe, while elderly people stroll leisurely around the square and children play joyfully in the park. The people of Edenwood greet each other with ease, as if everything is on a perfect and harmonious track. In this tranquil setting, Emma Harrison is the model figure everyone admires. She is a highly skilled doctor running her own clinic and providing meticulous healthcare services to the town's residents. Her warm smile and attentive care have earned her the admiration of countless patients. Her husband, Richard Harrison, is the town's ideal husband and father. As a high school history teacher, he is elegant and patient, always engaging with his students in thoughtful discussions, and his classes are filled with both wisdom and humor. The couple appears to have it all: successful careers, a harmonious family, and a deeply loving relationship that everyone around them envies. However, behind this peaceful town lies a secret that will eventually shatter their world. Like this story? Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more exciting content. As time passed, Emma Harrison's life began to change in subtle ways. Once full of energy, she gradually felt exhausted, both physically and mentally. As a doctor, her workload became increasingly overwhelming: endless consultations, long hours of treatment, and an ever-growing number of patients weighed heavily on her. What once was a passionate medical career had started to feel like a mechanical task, and the ever-increasing demands of her patients only added to the pressure. At home, Emma didn't find much comfort either. Her relationship with Richard, although outwardly still harmonious, had started to feel monotonous. Richard was busy with his teaching work, and when he came home at night, their conversations were often brief and routine. Over time, Emma felt a growing sense of loneliness that was hard to put into words. It was amidst this pressure and isolation that Emma met Mark Wilson. Mark, a successful businessman, was a regular patient of hers, coming in for routine checkups every month. He was charismatic, confident, and charming, qualities that made him stand out among her many patients. Every time he walked into the clinic, Emma couldn't help but notice the aura of self-assurance that seemed to surround him. At first, their interactions remained strictly professional. Mark would discuss his health issues with Emma, and she would provide the necessary medical advice. But over time, Emma began to notice something different in his demeanor. There was a certain kind of subtle flirtation in the way he spoke to her, his compliments more frequent, his gaze more lingering. At first, Emma dismissed it as nothing more than admiration for her professional abilities, but soon she found herself looking forward to their appointments with a sense of anticipation. One evening, after a routine appointment, Mark invited Emma to dinner. Originally, the idea was to discuss some health concerns, but the atmosphere at dinner quickly became more relaxed. Mark's smile was warm and inviting. His eyes held a certain teasing light. The playful banter between them grew more intimate, and soon Emma found herself letting go of her usual professional reserve. That evening she relaxed more than she had in a long time, enjoying the conversation and connection she had with him. After dinner, they stepped outside into the cool evening air. Mark gently took her hand, his gaze filled with an undeniable desire. Emma's heart began to race. She knew instinctively that this moment had been building, that it was inevitable. Without any warning, Mark leaned in, softly whispering, "Emma, I've wanted to tell you for a long time how much I like you." Before she could respond, Emma felt herself pulled into a passionate kiss, one that was full of urgency and longing. What followed was a whirlwind of emotions. They quickly found a quiet place, and the emotional tension between them grew into something more intense and physical. Though Emma knew what she was doing was wrong, the rush of passion and the release of years of frustration made her lose herself completely. Her relationship with Mark had shifted from one of doctor and patient to something far more intimate and secretive. Emma Harrison's heart was filled with turmoil and inner conflict. She knew her actions were wrong, not only betraying her professional ethics but also her husband Richard and the marriage vows she had once upheld. Each time she was with Mark, she could feel the overwhelming sense of guilt, knowing that she was deceiving Richard. But every time she tried to resist the temptation, she found herself unable to stop. The passion and thrill of the affair seemed to provide her with an escape from the pressures of daily life, and it became the only way for her to break free from her own inner turmoil. Gradually, Emma began to enjoy the feeling of being desired and wanted. She relished the attention and affection she was receiving from Mark, a stark contrast to the monotony she felt at home. The adrenaline rush, the secrecy, the excitement, it was as if she had found a temporary relief from the exhaustion of her everyday life. She became addicted to this sense of being alive, to the escape it provided from her responsibilities. With each passing day, her sense of guilt was replaced by numbness, and her internal boundaries began to blur. As Emma fell deeper into this spiral, she started to find emotional solace in other patients as well. Whenever she interacted with them, she would sense their need, their dependence on her, and it made her feel more needed and valued than she had in a long time. Her emotional connection to her patients grew stronger, and what had begun as professional relationships morphed into more intimate, personal ones. Soon Emma was involved with several others beyond Mark. David Hopkins was one of them. He was a young lawyer dealing with anxiety from a high-profile case. Emma had been treating him for his stress, but their professional relationship quickly turned personal. After a therapy session one evening, David lingered in her office, his face etched with vulnerability. He admitted how overwhelmed he was, and Emma's heart ached with sympathy. His words struck a chord deep inside her, and before she knew it, they were sharing more than just a therapeutic conversation. David sought comfort, and Emma, craving that emotional connection, found herself giving it. Their relationship quickly escalated to a point where they crossed the line, and soon they were having an affair. At the same time, Emma's relationship with James Taylor, a widowed middle-aged man, began to deepen. James had been coming to Emma for therapy to deal with his depression after the death of his wife. Emma, always a compassionate soul, found herself particularly moved by his sorrow. She began to spend more time listening to him talk about his late wife, offering him warmth and understanding. Their bond grew stronger, and Emma found herself more emotionally involved than she ever intended. One evening, after a particularly intimate session, James confided in her how much he appreciated her support. Emma, feeling a rare emotional connection, responded by giving him the comfort he was looking for, and soon they too crossed the professional boundary. Meanwhile, there was Michael Gray, an artist with a troubled past. His artistic soul and deeply introspective nature drew Emma in, and the two began to have deep, emotional conversations during his therapy sessions. As their bond strengthened, the line between patient and confidant blurred, and eventually their connection became physical. They found comfort in each other's presence, escaping their own personal struggles in the process. Emma's life had become a complicated web of lies and infidelity. With each affair, she felt a temporary sense of fulfillment, yet each relationship added another layer of complexity to her already tangled existence. She was no longer the devoted wife, the caring professional she had once been. Now, she was someone else entirely, someone caught in a whirlwind of emotions and deceit. Richard remained blissfully unaware of Emma's double life. He still thought she was the perfect wife, the woman he loved and admired. Emma had become skilled at hiding her secrets, and Richard saw nothing amiss. He continued to support her, believing she was overwhelmed by work, and that everything in their marriage was fine. But Emma knew deep down that she was living a lie. She had stepped so far beyond the bounds of morality and loyalty that it seemed impossible to return to the life she once had. As time passed, Richard began to notice changes in his wife, Emma. She was no longer the warm, enthusiastic woman she once was, and the atmosphere at home had become colder. Emma seemed distracted, often zoning out during their conversations, and their talks had become short and perfunctory. Dinner time, which they used to spend sharing the events of their day and small daily worries, was now marked by Emma finding excuses to avoid deeper conversation. Even in the bedroom at night, she had started spending excessive time on her phone, looking down at it, her gaze avoiding Richard's. All these changes made Richard uneasy. Several times, he tried to sit down with Emma to talk, expressing his concern for her. He knew how demanding her job was and had always tried to be supportive. However, every time he tried to bring it up, Emma would dismiss it lightly, saying, "I'm just too tired. The work pressure is overwhelming. There's nothing to discuss." Her tone lacked the warmth and patience it once had, and instead, it was distant and indifferent. Richard felt a growing sense of heaviness in his heart. He realized that something was beginning to create a gap between them. Richard was not a man who suspected others easily. He knew the beautiful life they had built together and cherished their bond. Yet, as Emma's behavior became increasingly abnormal, his discomfort turned into suspicion. He began paying closer attention to every detail: her cold attitude, her avoidance of him, and the excessive time spent on her phone all seemed too unusual to ignore. On several occasions, he unintentionally noticed vague text messages on Emma's phone, with no name attached to the sender. This fueled his growing doubts. Richard lacked the courage to directly confront Emma about her possible infidelity. He was reluctant to face such a possibility. The seed of suspicion had been planted quietly, but he wasn't ready to confirm it. He told himself that perhaps he was just being overly sensitive, or maybe Emma truly was overwhelmed by work. Richard had always trusted Emma deeply, and did not want to believe she would betray him. However, the heaviness in Richard's heart only grew. He realized that the distance between them was widening, a rift he could no longer ignore. Even though he refused to admit it, Emma's coldness and their emotional distance had left him feeling that something in their relationship was irreparably broken. Richard became anxious and confused, unsure of how to fix what was happening. That day, Richard came home as usual, opened the mailbox, and found an envelope with no return address. The envelope looked plain, even somewhat old, but its presence stirred an unsettling sense of foreboding in Richard's heart. He tore open the envelope, and inside was a piece of paper with clear handwriting. "Your wife, Emma Harrison, has been involved in improper relationships with several patients outside of your marriage." Richard's heart skipped a beat, and his gaze locked onto the contents of the letter. The letter listed, in great detail, Emma's relationships with several patients, including Mark Wilson, David Hopkins, James Taylor, and Michael Gray. Each name was accompanied by shocking details, things Richard had never heard of before, things he never imagined. It felt as though Richard had been dropped into a bottomless abyss. His heart seemed to stop, and his mind went blank as he read the contents. Each detail was like a sharp knife, relentlessly cutting into his chest. In that moment, Richard felt as though he had lost everything that once held him together. The emotional pain was so overwhelming that he couldn't immediately react, mechanically folding the letter back into the envelope and staring blankly at the floor. His world had collapsed in an instant. Richard knew that the contents of the letter could not be fabricated, and the changes he had noticed over the past few months now made sense. His wife, Emma, the woman he loved, had betrayed him, betrayed the life they had built together. The letter's contents ruthlessly revealed the truth behind the doubts Richard had harbored but had never fully confronted. Richard's fingers clenched the envelope tightly, feeling all his strength drain away. Finally, he gathered the courage to put the letter in his pocket, slowly walking toward the kitchen where Emma was busy preparing dinner. She was chopping vegetables with her usual ease and grace, as if nothing had changed between them. Richard stood in the doorway, took a deep breath, and suddenly had no words. He silently took the anonymous letter from his pocket and unfolded it in front of Emma. The moment Emma saw the letter, her face turned pale. A flicker of panic flashed in her eyes, and she quickly turned away, unable to face Richard. Her hands trembled slightly, and a piece of chopped vegetable nearly fell to the table. Richard didn't speak, only watched her, his heart racing as the tension in the air became palpable. He knew at that moment she had been exposed. Richard's heart felt as though it had been struck by a sledgehammer, with pain and rage intertwining within him. He could not understand, could not accept any of it. Emma, the woman he had loved, his wife, had betrayed him, betrayed their marriage and family. The details in the letter were like daggers, stabbing deep into his chest. Every name, every detail, burned through him like flames. He felt like he was falling apart, and all rationality and composure shattered in an instant. Why? Why would you do this? Richard's voice trembled, filled with restrained anger as he turned to face Emma, his eyes full of disappointment and endless hurt. He could not control his emotions. The woman who had once been his perfect partner was now nothing more than a symbol of betrayal. Emma sat on the sofa, her tears already blurring her vision. Her shoulders trembled slightly as though she wanted to say something but found herself speechless. She knew that no matter what she said, it couldn't change the facts. She lowered her head and choked back a sob. "Richard, I am so sorry. I couldn't control myself." Her voice was weak, a mere whisper, mixed with regret and sorrow, but it felt powerless, as if no apology could undo the mistakes she had made. Richard stood there, unable to bear the sight of Emma. Her apology seemed so empty, so meaningless. It could not undo the harm she had caused him or their family. Richard's eyes filled with anger, and the deep pain inside him made it hard to breathe. Every tear, every apology felt like another betrayal, another wound to his dignity and trust. His hands began to shake, and every fiber of his being trembled with rage. "You betrayed me! You betrayed everything we had!" Richard nearly shouted, his words shaking with anger. "How could you do this? How could you put me through this?" His eyes burned with fury, and all his rationality seemed to crumble. The emotions he had tried to control had boiled over, and now he couldn't stop them. His gaze became wild as though nothing mattered, but the torrent of anger surging within him. Emma continued to lower her head, tears falling uncontrollably. She knew Richard's anger could not be quelled, and that nothing she said would make a difference now. Richard's voice cut through the silence again, this time even more vicious. "You've shattered everything. You've shattered me." His voice cracked with emotion, and as he spoke, his anger began to consume him entirely. Every word, every exclamation was an attack on the woman he once thought he knew. Without warning, Richard's eyes narrowed, and a flash of madness passed through them. He strode to the corner of the room where a heavy marble statue stood, once a wedding gift, a symbol of their love. Richard didn't hesitate. He seized the statue, feeling its weight, as though the power it gave him could release all the pain and frustration that had been building up inside him. At that moment, time seemed to stand still. Richard's hand gripped the heavy marble sculpture tightly, his eyes filled with a mix of anger and pain, as though he had lost control of his own body. When he hurled the sculpture at Emma, the air was pierced by the sharp sound of breaking. The sculpture struck Emma in the head, and she didn't react. Her body collapsed to the floor like a kite with its string cut. Blood began to flow from her head, quickly staining the entire floor. Richard stood frozen, wide-eyed, his mind consumed by shock and disbelief. At that instant, he truly realized the extent of his rage, and the consequences that followed were too dire to comprehend. He couldn't believe that the woman he had once loved and cherished was now lying in a pool of blood, the result of his fury. His heart nearly stopped beating, and the air seemed to become unbearably heavy. "Emma," he whispered, his voice full of regret and disbelief. Richard hastily knelt beside her, his hands trembling as he tried to revive her. But it was already too late. Emma's face was pale, and her breathing had stopped. Blood continued to pour from her head, staining the floor as if time itself had come to a halt. Richard's tears finally broke free, his eyes filled with uncontrollable sadness and despair. The beautiful life they had once shared, the years they had spent together, now seemed so far out of reach. All his regret was meaningless now. The only thing he could do was silently cry and wallow in unchangeable guilt. He held Emma's cold hand tightly, as if trying to bring her back to life through this gesture, but the cruel reality shattered any hope he had left. Soon the sound of police sirens broke the silence. When the police arrived, they were shocked by the scene in front of them. Richard was covered in blood, sitting next to Emma's lifeless body, his eyes vacant, his tear-streaked face showing no sign of resistance. He did not flee or try to escape. When he saw the officers approach, he lowered his head, his voice choking. "It's me, I did it. Please, please take me away." The police quickly sealed off the scene, and investigators began to collect evidence. Richard remained with his head lowered, showing no resistance. His crime was undeniable. At that moment, Richard's world completely shattered. All the regrets and sorrow in the world could not undo the irreversible mistake he had made. Emma and Richard's tragedy quickly became the focal point of the media. The case sparked widespread public attention, with news outlets constantly revealing Emma's extramarital affairs and Richard's violent reaction after his emotional collapse. The entire town was overshadowed by this tragedy, and what was once a harmonious community became divided because of the case. Many people felt sorry for Emma, who had once been a respected doctor with countless friends and patients, but her choices ultimately led her down the path to death. Meanwhile, some sympathized with Richard, believing that his loss of control after his wife's betrayal was understandable. The courtroom debates were intensely heated. Richard's defense attorney emphasized that Emma's infidelity deeply wounded Richard's psyche, and his violent behavior was a result of extreme emotional collapse and the unbearable betrayal. The defense tried to frame the case as a tragic emotional conflict, with Richard being a once-kind husband who finally snapped after years of accumulated pain. The defense focused on emotional outbursts, hoping to secure a reduced sentence for Richard. However, the prosecution had a very different stance. They accused Richard of losing control, but they also argued that he was cold and unfeeling, claiming that after discovering his wife's betrayal, he had ample time to calm down instead of delivering a fatal blow in anger. The prosecution contended that Richard's actions were not merely an emotional outburst, but rather a violent response that had been carefully considered, showing a tendency toward violence. After several months of trial, the court finally handed down its verdict. Richard was convicted of second-degree murder. Although it wasn't first-degree murder, the second-degree conviction still sentenced him to life imprisonment. The once gentle history teacher was now a prisoner behind bars. When Richard heard the verdict, he lowered his head, his face devoid of emotion, only filled with deep self-reproach and regret. He knew that nothing could be undone, and the rest of his life would be spent behind prison walls. At the same time, Emma's tragedy received no redemption. Her death marked the end of her career, and it also left an unhealable scar on her family. Once a highly respected doctor in the community, she became the subject of gossip and speculation. Her choices ultimately robbed her of all her brilliance and beauty, leading her into eternal darkness. This story offers a profound warning. Deception and betrayal in relationships are often the beginning of disaster. Every decision we make may lead to unforeseen consequences. Emotional loss of control can cause us to lose our rationality in an instant, and the cost of that loss is often heavy. It reminds us to cherish the people in our lives, to think carefully before acting, and to avoid making decisions that could destroy our lives and future. Through Emma and Richard's story, we should be more aware of our choices and actions. There are no so-called harmless secrets in life. Every seemingly small lie, every seemingly harmless decision can eventually trigger consequences we can't bear. We hope that when facing choices in life, we all take more care, as the abyss of emotions can often be reached in an instant.